Alright everybody, welcome back to Mr. McGee's Basement. We are going to get set in this video. We're actually not learning so much as going through the study guide. Some of you guys may have forgotten some of the stuff that we learned, but we're going to go through the study guide that gets us ready for the midterm. And remember, if you need to know the instructions of when the tests are taking place, please refer back to the earlier video that is also linked on this module. Okay? So, without further ado, let's get started on the study guide. Alright, now you guys should be taking a look at the study guide. That's what you should see on the screen for you. We're just going to go through the notes. We're going to go through them in a little bit of depth, just so that you can remember some details and some facts, and also so that you can start getting ready and studying, especially for my 5th and 6th period who are seeing this for the first time. You can really get an idea of, hey, what do I need to study? So let's take a look. So notes, that's our first section. Anything from your UK notes. Now, UK meaning United Kingdom. So I want you to think about this. These are the UK notes, and you'll also notice that those UK notes are linked in today's module. But those UK notes, that's when we learned about the United Kingdom. We learned about the fact that it has the 5th largest economy in the world. We learned about the fact that the United Kingdom is a constitutional monarchy, meaning that they have a king or queen, but that king or queen is just a figurehead. You guys remember that term, figurehead? So they're just a figurehead. The real power is with the prime minister. So Queen Elizabeth II is the Queen of England, but she has no real power. The power is with Prime Minister Boris Johnson. So those are the things that we talked about. We also talked about the fact that Parliament is the name of the United Kingdom's legislature. We talked about the fact that Parliament is made up of 2 houses, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. I'm hoping that for some of you guys, hearing those names, it's starting to ring a bell because that was stuff that we went over with the United Kingdom. I'm hoping you're thinking, oh, okay, yeah, I remember that. We also talked about the fact that the United Kingdom has companies like Vodafone. They have Shell, BP, if you remember the gas companies, the oil companies, BP and Shell. So those are the things that as you look back through your UK notes, make sure that you pay attention to, okay? Anything from Russia notes. Again, remember Vladimir Putin, the guy who has way too much self-confidence in his own appearance? All right, if you guys remember that, because he always had those pictures of him shirtless doing manly things. All right, well, we're talking about Russia, so you need to go back and look at Russia and go, oh, okay, wow. I'm looking at Russia. I remember that oil is the lifeblood of the country. I remember that they're a democracy in name only. I'm hoping that you're thinking to yourself, oh, not only are they a democracy in name only, but they're really totalitarian. Remember that their economic system is closer to command. It's between mixed and command, but leaning towards command because you have the leader of the country pretty much operates like a dictator. So hopefully you remember that. Off the top of my head, I'll put it in the description box below if I mess it up, but Russia has the 12th largest economy. Remember we talked about the fact that just because you have the largest land area in no way means that somehow you're going to be number 1 in everything just because you're number 1 in terms of the largest country. Alright, now if you remember Germany notes, hopefully you will remember that Germany has a parliamentary democracy. If you remember the Chancellor of Germany, because she's not called a prime minister, so even though it's a parliamentary democracy, and normally when we talk about a parliamentary democracy, the leader is a prime minister. Remember, in Germany, the leader is called a chancellor. So Chancellor Angela Merkel is the head of Germany. Hopefully you remember their parliament is made up of 2 houses, the Bundestag and the Bundesrat. Again, hopefully those names are coming back to you. Remember, Germany has the 4th largest economy in the world, and not only do they have the 4th largest economy, but they have a ton of companies that we know today. Remember, we talked about BMW, Audi, Mercedes, Porsche, Adidas, Puma. There's a lot of pharmaceutical companies that come out of Germany. Okay? Now, keep that in mind. Remember that. Also remember, what is the name of that interstate system that we model our interstate system off of here in the United States? It's called the Autobahn. Hopefully you remember that there are certain sections of the Autobahn where there is no speed limit. Those are your Germany notes. And by the way, your Germany, Russia, and UK notes are all linked in today's module. So you can open those up, and I put them in PDF form. So even though it's a PowerPoint, it's in PDF. So you can open that and be able to look at any of those notes anytime that you need it. They'll all be in the same location. You should be pretty familiar with the European Union notes, considering that the European Union was on the last test that we did for history, the Europe history test. So I'm not going to go through the European Union notes. You should already know what you need to study for that. Now, if you remember, way a long time ago, we talked about some of the environmental issues that you can find in Europe. So what is acid rain, and why was it a problem for Germany? So I want you to think about that. What is acid rain, and why was it a problem for Germany? Oh, acid rain is where you have clean rain that falls through polluted air. And so that rain, once it falls through the polluted air, by the time it hits the ground, that rain becomes acidic. And remember, we talked about acid rain does not mean, oh, I'm melting, I'm being eaten alive by the acid. Remember, acid has different levels of strength. So this acid rain isn't going to melt your flesh off. But if plants absorb that water, it damages plants. It also damages paint on buildings. It wears away statues over time. And so we talked about, man, it was damaging the Black Forest of Germany, a very famous forest in Germany. All right, so keep that in mind. Make sure you remember that. What was the Chernobyl disaster? Well, remember Chernobyl? That was the world's worst nuclear power plant accident. It took place in the Soviet Union, and think about it, now you know more about the Soviet Union. Now, in the land in the Soviet Union, that land that we now know is Ukraine, that's where Chernobyl is located. Remember what we said? You had an explosion, and what did that explosion release into the air? Oh, a radiation cloud. And the wind carried that radiation cloud over many parts of Europe, or many countries in Europe. And we talked about, okay, well, what is the problem with that? Well, we saw that, especially for certain countries right around Ukraine, damaged some of their land's ability to produce crops. So some of the land around Chernobyl was no longer arable. And we also talked about the fact that the government covered it up because they were embarrassed about the power plant disaster. And so people weren't evacuated in time, even who lived around the area. So keep that in mind. Chernobyl, know what Chernobyl is. All right, it's a nuclear power plant. Worst nuclear power plant disaster in the history of the world. Now, why is pollution a big problem for the UK? I'm going to change that, by the way. So if you notice when you pull up that study guide, it should be in past tense, because even though the UK still deals with pollution, we're really focusing on the 1952 smog event. So remember what smog is. That is smoke mixed with fog equals smog. And so what was the problem in 1952? We had a ton of coal-powered power plants, and everyone burned coal in their homes. And so there's a lot of pollution in the air. And that mixed with this huge fog that had settled over London. And if you remember some of the things that we saw, some of the video that we looked at, pollution was so bad they had to cancel school because they were afraid of kids getting lost trying to walk back to their homes. You had policemen out with flashlights and with torches trying to direct traffic so that buses didn't collide with other buses or other cars. And we talked about the fact that 4,000 people died in the immediate aftermath of that just from lung problems from breathing in that pollution. That the United Kingdom had to pass the Clean Air Act, I think that was 4 years later in 1956. And so even today, the United Kingdom still has a lot of pollution regulation rules in place just to stop another disaster like that from happening again. By the way, I know I'm talking fast because I want to make sure that this is under 20 minutes as a video. So let's take a look here. We're on the geography part. On what two continents is Russia located? Ladies and gentlemen, if you say anything other than Europe and Asia, I'm going to start to wonder what you were paying attention to all year. Okay? So those are the only two continents Russia is on. Europe and Asia. On what part of Russia does 75% of the population live? All right, hopefully if you remember that, They live on the European part of Russia. In other words, the western part of Russia. And even though the western or European part of Russia is smaller, its climate is less harsh. And you have more of a chance of being able to live and survive there than in the larger section of Eastern Russia, also called Asian Russia. And you remember the Arctic Circle kind of dips into a big section, it's not a majority of Eastern Russia, but still dips into a large section of Eastern Russia, which makes it a lot colder. Why do many young people in Europe speak multiple languages? Hopefully, if you've looked at your map, hopefully you kept your maps of Europe. If you remember, most of the countries that border any country in Europe, the people speak another language, so you have to know multiple languages, unless you're planning on just staying in your country all your life. Where do rivers start? Rivers always start in high places, so I want you to remember that. Rivers start in high places and then flow down due to gravity. Alright, now, those are the countries. I don't need to go through them, but I just need you to know those are the countries, capitals, and physical features that you need to be able to locate on a map. Okay? So keep that in mind. Countries, capitals, and physical features that you need to be able to locate on a map. So you're going to have a lot of multiple choice questions on your test, but there will be a section of the test that involves a map. And you have to be able to, again, locate the countries, capitals, and physical features that are on that map. Alright, vocabulary. We're going back to some of the basics that we covered earlier in the year. What is literacy rate? Oh, that's the percentage of the people in the country, the adults in the country who can read and write. What is GDP? Well, first of all, GDP means gross domestic product. But what does GDP mean? That's the amount of money that a country takes in through trade in 1 year. So how much money comes into the country through trade in a year? What is GDP per capita? Remember we said per capita is a Latin word, but we should not get confused or scared by hearing that. Per capita basically means per person. So GDP per capita means how much does the average person in a certain country make in a year. So we could look at the GDP of the United States and say, oh, the country of the United States, meaning the country of the United States, takes in this amount of money comes into the country through trade in 1 year. But when we say GDP per capita, what we do is we take the GDP and divide it by the number of people in the United States. And whatever that answer is, that's the average amount of money that a person in the United States makes in a year. Let me try that again. That is the money, that's the amount of money that the average person in the United States makes in a year. Okay? So, what is agriculture? Agriculture is farming, and farming is made up of two things. That is what? Growing crops, raising livestock. What is arable? Arable means, can this land produce crops? So land that is arable is good for farming. In other words, it can produce crops. So if we were looking at a desert, we would say, wow, that land is not arable because it cannot produce crops. What is capital? Capital is money, material, time, and technology. So those are the things that you need in order to create your own business. What is human capital? That is education and training. If you remember from a really early video that I made, we talked about the fact that if you want to open a restaurant, well, you need the money to buy the building, you know the materials, pots and pans, how much time it's going to take to run the restaurant, but you need human capital. You need people who know how to cook. You need people who are educated enough or trained by yourself in how you want them to talk to their customers. All right, what is an entrepreneur? An entrepreneur is someone who either invests in someone else's business or they start their own business. All right, by the way, as to GDP per capita, I believe I had it right the first time. I'm sorry, I'm mixing up all my terms. So, just for a recap, so in case you're confused, GDP per capita is the average amount of money that a person in a particular country makes in a year. So I had it right the first time. I don't know why I switched it around. All right, let's go to economics. What is the difference between a market economy, mixed economy, and command economy? All right, so pretty simple. Market, easiest way to put it, this is where the citizens own their own business. So that means that the citizens determine what their business will produce and how much they will charge for a product. Skipping to a command economy, this is where the government owns all the businesses. It is the government who determines what will be produced and how much will be charged. Another name for command is communism. Another name for market is capitalism. Remember we said mixed. Mixed is kind of weird because you have the mixed, basically you can look at mixed as where the government owns large businesses and citizens own the smaller businesses. And we said that's one way of looking at mixed, and sometimes people mean mixed in that sense, where, all right, the government's taking a little bit of control of some things, and there's still some private ownership. Other people, when they mean mixed, they just mean socialism. And we said socialism, you mean socialism? Socialism is just another name for communism. It's just different name, same result. Okay, so it depends on what you're talking about. Normally on tests, mixed means mix between market and command. They're not talking about socialism, but when they are talking about socialism, socialism and communism are basically the same thing. All right, government. What is the difference between parliamentary and representative? Presidential democracy. Okay, so the reason again that I have presidential in parentheses is because on a milestone test, they like to put presidential as the term instead of representative, even though nobody says presidential democracy in real life. Okay, but presidential just means representative. So parliamentary democracy, this is where the people vote for the political party. And that's who they vote for. And then whichever political party wins, the leader of that party automatically becomes the leader of the country, the prime minister. In a representative democracy, you have the people vote for the person. Okay, so they don't vote for the political party, they vote for the person. We just saw this in the United States. You had a presidential election between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And so people either voted for Donald Trump or for Joe Biden. They did not vote for the Republican Party or the Democrat Party. What is the difference between absolute and constitutional monarchy? If you remember, in an absolute monarchy, the king or queen, first of all, monarchy means that the leader of the country gets their power because their parents had that power before them. So their power is inherited. They don't get it because, they were voted in or because someone selected them from a group of candidates. Right? Absolute monarchy, the king or queen has absolute power. Whatever they say becomes law, and they are above the law. They don't actually have to follow the law themselves. Constitutional monarchy, on the other hand, is where you have a king or queen, but they are under the law. They have to obey the law, and they have no real power. They are just a figurehead. The real power is with the prime minister. What is the only real difference between totalitarianism and fascism? If you remember what we talked about before, totalitarianism and fascism, the government has total control over everything in both systems. And so there are no freedoms for the people. But we said fascism tends to put an extra emphasis on national unity and ethnic identity and focusing on that along with the government taking control over everything. So there's sometimes, again, an added emphasis in fascism on ethnic identity and national unity. All right, so again, those are your main differences, but otherwise they do the exact same thing. Okay? So for you guys, I'm going to go ahead and pick up this camera. You know what you need to study. I'm going to be on conference with you, so if you have any questions, jump on conference with me. Conference will be at our normal class times. So if you have any questions, that's your chance to talk to me. You don't have to, for my third and fourth period, you don't have to get on conference with me, but it is available if you have any questions, okay? So, take care, guys.